This session is called The Latest and Greatest from the POW Science Alliance, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we have a lot of different diverse perspectives and expertises on our Science Alliance, and that all of the folks on our Science Alliance are resources for all of you to use. So you are in this session. We asked you to be in this session because we are assuming somewhere along the way, or not assuming, we know somewhere along the way you all have had some Climate Science 101 training with POW. And so this is kind of a next level. We know you know the basics of climate science, and now we're going to kind of talk about the diversity of what we have on our Science Alliance. And so Dylan is going to moderate for us this morning, so I'm going to turn it over to Dylan, and you'll get to meet some of our great scientists that we work with. So, Dylan.
Morning, y'all. I'm Dylan. I'm filling in for Nina here. So,
Speak up, Dylan.
Yeah. I'm filling in for Nina, so I won't fill those shoes entirely, but I'm a professional mountain biker for Specialized, and I run a trail stewardship for Central California. So you're probably wondering why someone who spends all his time in the dirt is moderating a science panel. But fortunately, in my past, I got a master's in quaternary climate science and geomorphology, which lends itself to kind of my nonprofit work, and then also towards like outdoor pursuits. So answering questions and connecting science to mountain biking and skiing and fly fishing. But today, kind of learning from these guys, we're just going to be taking that science communication to the next level. And they can tell us a bit about their work, but hopefully that triggers some questions from you all, and then has more communication between the pillars of creative and science and athletes. Kind of creates some really cool future projects. So if you guys can all hear everyone, there's no mic in here, but I think something big to recognize here, and like big thanks to Nina for this, is in the past the Science Alliance was really cryosphere based, and things that we as skiers understood, which snow change, glacial impact, direct climate impacts on our work as skiers and snowboarders. The Science Alliance has expanded a ton to include more social sciences, more physical sciences, and we're going to see some of that spectrum here and kind of hear from them. So hopefully that triggers a little bit more understanding of kind of the intersectionality between science and cultural issues and equity and athletics. So yeah, I think what we'll do here is just have them all introduce themselves briefly with just who you are and your affiliations and what you like to do in the outdoors, and then we'll dive into your presentation.
I'm Greg Nemeth. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I love being out in the snow. And then I'm originally from Canada, and so I grew up playing hockey on lakes. And when I moved to Wisconsin 15 years ago, I realized there's a thriving pond hockey community there, which has just been fabulous. There's a guy who's 70 years old and doesn't have a smartphone or a car, but has a bike and scouts out the best ice, and we have a good game almost every day. But there's one problem. If you can advance it one click on the clicker. Yeah, so Lake Monona that I'm skating there is the most studied lake in the world. We have temperature records and ice cover records for 150 years. And you can see what's happening. There's a lot of noise in the data, just like every climate indicator has, but a clear trend downward. And so this is one of these things that we're experiencing as a community, where we have, instead of a 4-month hockey season, we have a 3-month hockey season. And it's continuing in that direction. So that's something I feel passionate about. This is that sport there is what got me through a really bleak COVID winter. It was the one thing where we had people getting together and we got our blood moving and our bodies moving, and it felt so good. And so that's part of the reason I'm here. It's for these winter sports that give me so much. So.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Dr. Jenny Watts. I'm with Woodwell Climate Research Center in Massachusetts. I'm also affiliate professor in environmental science in Montana at Montana State University, Bozeman. That's my home base, and my primary job is tracking greenhouse gas exchange across high latitude ecosystems, including CO2 and methane. And this is me north of the Berks Range. That's kind of my happy place, being out in the middle of nowhere, with a gas analyzer. That's what I love to do. I also love skiing. That's what brought me to Montana in the first place. I did start out as a snowboarder, and Jeremy Jones was on my wall as a high schooler. A little crush there. And then in the summer, watching you. True confessions.
Careful, tips here.
You're also a hero. I'm not a claimer, but you're amazing. In the summer too, a lot of road trips across the West. So my mountain bike, and that'll kind of lead into my presentation in a minute.
Hey everyone, I'm Jesse. I'm an environmental historian, and I do Native American and Indigenous studies as well. I'm a skier. This is the only cool picture of me skiing that anyone has ever taken, so I decided to share it while I can. I'm at University of Texas Austin right now, finishing up my PhD. We'll hopefully be somewhere with a lot more snow in the next year. So.
So we're going to start with a presentation on some research by Jenny, Dr. Watts, and yeah, we'll move through everyone. We'll just hold questions till probably do you want to do questions at the end of all three? Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, can everyone hear me? Okay, I'll try to speak up, and if I'm not loud enough, just keep raising the hand.
Good in the back.
Great. So I'm going to walk you through a project that I started a few years ago, and this is something that is near and dear to my heart because for a long, long time I've been working in Arctic ecosystems, and I get really depressed because a lot of bad things are happening up there, just like around the world. So climate crisis is real. I see it in my everyday work. Every time I go to the Arctic, it looks worse and worse. The permafrost is collapsing. That's in northern Alaska. We see it all across Siberia too, and a lot of places in Canada. So really just massive land collapse because it's getting too warm. Fires, so real. We're experiencing that here with the smoke, and constant danger, drought, and then in other places we have extreme flooding. So we're a world that's becoming warmer and warmer, and we're moving to more and more to extremes. That's just reality. That's our life. So one thing that I wanted to start with as I move into this idea of climate mitigation work with natural climate, I want to make it really clear that we humans have been really busy pumping carbon into our atmosphere. So this is the number one thing we need to do is just cut emissions as we move forward. The second thing that we need to do is invest in green technologies. Tech is really important. That'll help us work our way out of it. And then a third component, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, more recently, is investing in our ecosystems, our lands, as natural-based climate mitigators. So climate solutions, natural climate solutions is kind of a buzzword out there right now. And I personally don't like it because it's not an end-all solution. Instead, I'd like to use the term climate mitigation. So working with our natural systems to help sequester carbon. So moving into, well, what does a natural climate mitigator look like? So natural systems, this is near the Yellowstone Club outside of Bozeman, Montana, biking last weekend. And if you look at this natural landscape, just like everything around us, what we're really working towards here, the net goal is with land use to improve our land so we have more green, more vegetation that's active, taking in carbon. We want to reduce how much land, so that here's a trail that's a net release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So we're working with the natural land through better land management. And the end goal is to increase carbon storage, both above ground and then ultimately below ground in our soils where it stays protected for longer. So the idea with natural climate mitigators is by working with healthy ecosystems through better land management and better carbon sinks, we get a lot of additional benefits. We have investments in our land. So we prefer to be looking at this beautiful surroundings instead of something that has been totally destroyed. You know, we're working with healthy land. And in addition, that gives us clean water, clean air, healthy communities, so a lot of resources. And then we're also at the same time trying to mitigate against climate change because of that increase in carbon dioxide uptake and then storage. So this is a case study that I started working on as a project a few years ago, and this was really driven after all these years of working on NASA projects using remote sensing and field observations to try to track how much carbon is being released from these high latitude systems as a result of human activities elsewhere. I wanted a project that was closer to home, something that I could actually work out on the landscape with communities to change, to actually have a better ecosystem as a result. So that led to this case study looking at rangeland systems in the western US. It's a lot of land. Everyone who's driven across the western US, I mean, every time I do that, it's very humbling. There's over 700 million acres out there that is considered open range. So these are open lands. A lot of times they're also used for cattle grazing and a lot of recreation too. Unfortunately, our lands across the West are severely degraded after years of overuse. This is a map from my colleague John Sanderman, and he published in 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Everything in red is degraded. I'm guessing a lot of us live in these degraded landscapes. And this is unfortunate because this means unhealthy ecosystems who are not capturing carbon and storing carbon. So our goal is to reverse this through better land use so we can reduce the red and get more green. And rehabilitating these lands by working with people who are managing lands ultimately will improve carbon capture and our ecosystem services. So again, we want to go from a situation like we see on the my left, where you have a lot of bare ground, to something that's more productive, more biodiverse, more healthy, that is also serving as a carbon capture and climate mitigator. Okay, so the motivation, I teamed up a few years ago with John Sanderman, who had that map in red. And using my background with the NASA climate modeling, bringing together information from satellites and field observations, and then his background as a soil scientist, we were like, okay, well, why don't we take these technologies and we apply it to our rangeland systems so we can actually see what's happening across the western US. So right now, unfortunately, there isn't a model in place that allows us to do that, and that was the motivator here. So we're like, okay, we've been monitoring high latitudes for years. We can apply these similar technologies and create a model for the western US. So that's what we've been doing. And this is in conjunction with Montana State University and also Colorado State University. And the end goal too is a lot of these land managers, they go out on the land and that's how they assess the condition. If we put together this tool through Google Earth Engine, and similar to that climate tool that we saw earlier where you can go online and you can put in your location and then you can see this working in the back end, but what you get is a map of your land for free. That's what we're working towards. So we're providing data for free in the hands of land managers. Okay, so a case study, we started in Montana working with a few ranchers, and today I'm going to just give you a snapshot of what we've been doing in western Colorado for our pilot research sites. So not only do we want to build a model that we can apply anywhere across the West, we want to make sure it's accurate. So we're going out in the land and we're collecting a lot of data. So one thing that we've done in western Colorado is we teamed up with the Conscious Bay Company. They're based out of Boulder, and it's a land management, land holding company, and they're really interested in climate mitigation. So they brought us in as scientists, and we're working on their ranches in western Colorado to try to quantify how their land use is affecting the environment and carbon capture. So these are a few pictures from western Colorado a few months ago. And some of the things that we're doing on the land is measuring vegetation. We're also collecting a lot of soil samples over a lot of different ranges of land use categories, just to quantify how much carbon is in the soil. This is me with my gas analyzer. I couldn't leave it at home. So yeah, me and my happy place. I've seen how productive these plants are, and then I'm also analyzing how much carbon is coming out from the soils too. And another thing, we're really interested in the impacts of grazing management. So we're setting up these control plots where the cows can't access, and then we're measuring long-term inside and outside. So we actually have some solid data to work with, as opposed to just, you know, oh, I think it's going to work. But we want to be able to back it up with science. Yeah, and this is something I don't encounter in the Arctic at all, but it's been fun working out on these grazing lands because the cows become part of the equation. And one thing that we kept encountering, there's these little round circles that we position our gas analyzers over for our chambers, and these cows kept pooping in them. Oh. So we were actually getting a lot of methane too. Look at how curious they are. Okay. And so this is what we're working towards. Being able to take all that information, combine it with information from satellites through the modeling system, and produce maps. Maps that will encompass the entire western U.S. So this map, this is one of their land holdings near Cedar Ridge, Colorado, and this is showing plant productivity over a year. So everything that's really, really green, those are the areas that the plants are capturing the most carbon. And then you see the distribution. And the darker areas are where they're really heavily irrigating the plants, and this is an area that they're restoring. It used to be a tilled cropping system, and then they revegetated to grassland. And we're using this information too to say, okay, you know, now that your plants are established, they're highly productive, you can kind of hold back on that irrigation. So this ties into water conservation too. But having these numbers and being able to show a land manager through a map, you know, that is really impactful, because suddenly they're able to see and tie in how their land management is connecting and influencing changes in vegetation. The other thing that we're looking at too is changes in carbon storage. And all these areas in red, those show areas that have more carbon storage, which is a good thing. And a lot of that in the south, that's connected with irrigated lands. But the other thing we were able to point out in this property too is that these northern areas where this circle is, just as much carbon storage. And instead of that heavily irrigated alfalfa, it's this slow and steady trees. So we're also able to say, okay, maybe you want to protect this area, because these slow and steady trees that don't require a lot of water, they're doing just as good of a job as your irrigated fields. And an important outcome of this study is working with the managers. So we're not out there just collecting data. We've taken the time to have a lot of conversations. So what I love about this picture is taking a few hours out of our day just to be in the same place as the people working the land, and be able to show them the data and have the conversations and learn from them too. So it's really a two-way street, and having that campfire conversations with people living across the West, I think is really, in addition to the science component, just as valuable, because this is what creates change. This is what creates community and brings us together for a common cause. So just to conclude, the top three things that I've taken away from this project is, first, it's really important to just take the time to have conversations. Without conversations, and a lot of these counties that we're working in are pretty conservative. They don't like to talk about climate change per se, but once you're out there in their home, on their land with them, and you're taking the time to listen, that creates connection. And then it doesn't take very long for them to acknowledge that, yeah, we've seen a lot of change. We're really worried about the landscape. We're worried about how it's getting warmer and drier, and we don't know what to do. The second thing is, don't shy away from that call to action. As a scientist, I think working with natural landscapes, I've been pretty timid in the past for going that extra step from talking about climate to what do we do about climate. But it's really important because that's the holdup. I think all of us in some capacity, we acknowledge that climate is affecting our personal lives. We need to know what to do about it. And so for these Western communities too, I think just like we talked about carrot sticks earlier, this is the last really important part, is providing those positive incentives for change. And I personally think that programs like San Miguel County in Colorado, they're starting these pilot programs to pay for good practices. A lot of these communities are land rich but money poor, and if we can pay for them to adopt better land management practices, it's a win-win for communities. Just like providing incentives for electric trucks. I think electric trucks are going to be really cool, and I can't wait to see them across the West in the next 10 years. And then training for green infrastructure. So we're supporting communities. We're not just telling them what to do. We don't want to do that. We want to create a better future together. Thank you.
Hey everyone, so my work, I study U.S. environmental history, and my sort of broader research is on the history of the ski industry, and I look at climate adaptive technologies over time holistically. Today I'm going to talk specifically about Arizona Snowbowl ski area, and this sort of goes into a larger part of my project and group of conversations I'm part of how we can think of environmental and climate justice more broadly, beyond just thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also thinking about historical reasons that these happen, sort of power distributions that mean that equity often isn't really equity, things like that. So what is the Snowbowl controversy? So Arizona Snowbowl is just north of Flagstaff in Arizona. The San Francisco Peaks are a sacred mountain. There has been a ski resort there since 1937. It's the fourth oldest in the country at this point. So the ski resort's been there for a long time. There's been 3 main lawsuit periods over this. So there's a big conflict in the early 70s, another one in the early 80s, and another one in the early 2000s. I'm going to talk about the one in the 80s and early 2000s. This has most recently become famous, I guess, because Snowbowl has started making artificial snow with reclaimed sewage water. They're not the only place in the world to do this. They're the only place in the world to do it exclusively with reclaimed sewage water. And, you know, there's all sorts of issues with toxicity in this. But part of what I'm going to ask you to do is actually try and move past this issue of toxicity, because the toxicity has been very attractive to settlers when they think about this problem, but the problem actually moves far beyond it, and if you're indigenous from this region, simply the infrastructure are actually the stakes, and whether or not you're making this snow is just sort of an addition to it. So Nina asked me to talk quickly about best practices for talking about indigenous issues as a settler. I mean, first and foremost, land acknowledgements. We're currently on Paiute land. It's also good to acknowledge where you're coming from if you're in a different place. I was born on traditional Lenape land in the southeast of so-called Pennsylvania. This is a good way to sort of remind ourselves that it's not just that here we are on indigenous land, where we come from, where we are going, all of these places are indigenous, but also most specific. It is not indigenous people's job to teach you. You can find so much information out there. There are so many books, so many websites, so many talks. We are at a point where most Native nations at least have a couple of people who are sociologists, anthropologists, historians working for the tribes, working outside of them. You know, there's obviously things that you need to talk to people about, but do the work yourself first. Use indigenous place names when possible. These are all of the Native nations and tribes who claim the San Francisco Peaks in one way or another. So you have the name they use, the English name next to them in parentheses, and then on the right you're going to have the mountain's name here. When you can use the names when you speak, I will be using Dene instead of Navajo. I have not yet learned to say, I'm going to talk mostly about the Dene and Hopi today. I have not yet learned to say the mountains' names, despite lots of people trying to teach me to do it at this point. And then avoid allyship, right? The goal is not to be an ally, the goal is to be a partner, a participant, right? You are not just standing there cheering people on, you are part of these fights. Okay, so this comes down to indigenous religion on some level. So what are we talking about when we're talking about indigenous religious rights? And this is a very big sort of legal issue, how we define religion. So to start with the peaks themselves, for the Hopi, Kasina live on these peaks. Kasina are ancestral spirits. They bring rain, they bring life from the peaks down to the Hopi Mesa. You can actually see the peaks from almost every Hopi village. That's sort of, they're specifically put in places to have the peaks be visible. And so this process is reciprocal. So the Kasina will bring rain, provided the Hopi practice specific ceremonies, that they go to the mountain, that they protect the mountain, and then the mountain will protect them. So there is no sort of Hopi religion outside of a relationship to this mountain, right? It is one and the same. For the Dene, it's a little bit different. For the Dene, you have 4 mountains that are the borders of Dinata, which are the sacred homelands. This is the northern mountain, but to do the blessing way ceremony, which is sort of the central cultural identifying practice for the Dene, you need pure dirt from this mountain as well as the other 3. You also need herbs for any medicine bundle used by the Dene. So it's not just that there are sacred things on this mountain, it is once again this mountain in particular. To talk about sort of what this actually means, this historian named Farina King, who is Dene, has come up with this term geopiety. And this is her way to talk about sort of piety, religion, and the environment and as a single place, as inseparable. And this has led to other people starting to rethink environmental justice, and some people beginning to use a term specifically indigenous environmental justice, which is from Dina Gileo Whitaker, who is a surfer and very involved in the surf world as well. Super cool, super nice. Okay, so there's 2 key laws that the Snowpole case sort of has revolved around. The first is the 1978 American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And so it has a little bit more text than this, but basically it shall be the policy of the United States to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise the traditional religions of the American Indian. What it does not include is the right to protect lands. And there were discussions about sacred lands, and when they had this bill, they chose not to put it in. There have been discussions every 10 to 15 years about passing new laws that do this. They inevitably don't pass because of business interests, usually. Then there's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. There's a very long history to why our religious rights needed to be restored, but for our purposes, it creates the substantial burden standard within the court. So the first case is Wilson v. Block. Wilson is actually a white man who owned a ranch at the base of the mountain. Because of the way lawsuits worked at the time, you needed an individual who you could sue on behalf of, and he also was very involved in this for a lot of reasons and had a lot of money to pay for lawyers and a lot of practice in environmental lawsuits. So during this court case, the chairman of the Hopi tribe gave testimony, and he explained that the desecration of the peaks will make the basis of our existence as a society become a mere fairy tale. Dene people gave very similar testimony. Some Apache, Yavapai, other people gave very similar testimony. The court, interestingly, held that these were sincerely held beliefs. So they did not question the legitimacy of it. They did not question this relationship. But what they did rule is that native traditional religious considerations do not always triumph over all else, and what they really meant is that they do not always triumph over other multi-use issues on Forest Service lands. And so sort of what they do in this process is that if you think about multi-use, you have businesses and economy, you have individuals who want recreation, and then you have native nations and individuals. And you have a reduction of native nations, the equivalent of a business or an individual, right? So my right to go and ski there is now legally equal to a nation's right to protect sacred homelands. The more recent case begins in 2006 as Navajo Nation et al., the Forest Service. Both of these went through a couple of rounds, so this is finally ruled on by a circuit court in 2009. But the Navajo Nation argued that the ski area posed a substantial burden under the Religious Freedom Reaffirmation Act. The court ruled that it didn't count, or didn't hold, because it is really meant to reflect an individual claim, not a group claim, and they must be forced to choose between their religion and a government benefit, or they must be coerced for it to be violated. So it's not really a violation of religious rights. So what are the takeaways from this? Well, the first, for Indigenous people especially, is that environment and religion are inseparable, and we need to stop talking about these as separate things. When we were talking about Indigenous environments, we were talking about religious environments, and the same is the other way around. The other thing is that if we think about what these technologies are that they're doing with the mountain, they need high altitude lifts so that they can get to places where snow is more consistent. They need groomers and landscaping to make sure that the slopes are as flat as possible, so they need less snow. They need snowmaking to adapt for the fact they built a ski resort in a place that frankly isn't all that well suited to have it be able to ski every day, even long before climate change. And of course the most recent one is an explicit response to climate change. So there is a question here that comes about of to what extent that we have to start making choices and thinking critically when we talk about climate adaptation. Some things might not be worth adapting, and like the amount of effort, energy, calories, mental bandwidth to make a place like Snowball work and then having sort of these repercussions on top of it versus the energy of simply going and skiing somewhere else should make this a much easier decision than it seems to be for a lot of people. Ways forward, if you're somebody creating a lot of content, these are just good things to keep in mind. Think about the way in which you talk about climate adaptation, think about where these technologies are going, not just who is getting the benefits and who isn't, but sort of what you actually need for these technologies to function. And then when you find yourself lobbying, environmental justice movements start at the grassroots, but injustice starts at the federal and state level. So when you have people's ears, right, you are in a place to at least try and push them to think about these things or push them in the right directions. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so my name is Greg Nemeth. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and I work on low carbon innovation. And I guess my message with all my work is climate problem is getting worse, but the solutions are getting better. And I started on this, I was working at a startup in Silicon Valley in the late 1990s and working on Sand Hill Road, and I was just impressed by how much talent and money and effort and research and patents were going into things like healthcare and IT and consumer products, but almost none was going into energy. And so I ended up going to Berkeley to do grad school with that question, is how can we stimulate innovation in energy? And so much has happened since then, and this is what I do. I study technologies and how they improve with the idea that we can learn from what's happened in the past to design policies to get technologies to improve in the future. And I've looked at lots of technologies. I try to stay agnostic about that. But the one that's been most dramatic is solar, and this is something I've been working on since I was in grad school, and a couple of years ago wrote a book on it. This is a miracle, and I think it's one of the most important things that's happening in climate today. And I think it's the main reason when I say the solutions are getting better, because this is happening in solar, it's happening in batteries for electric vehicles, it's happening in offshore wind, it's starting to happen in heat pumps, and there's other technologies for which we now have a playbook. And one of the benefits of going back in history and trying to understand what's happened in the past, like Jesse's been doing, is to say, what can we learn from it? And one thing we've seen with solar is the first commercial solar cell was purchased by the US Navy to run one of the first satellites in 1958. And the cost of that was $300,000 per megawatt hour. Conveniently, a megawatt hour is about the average electricity consumption for a household in the US. So your household energy bill for that month, if you did solar from those satellite panels, it would have been $300,000. If you do it in a large installation today, it's 20 bucks. So it's a factor of 10,000 has come down. And you can see that no one country did it. In short, the US created the technology, the Germans created a market, and the Chinese made it cheap. And it's been this sequence, this relay race, this global innovation system that's led to this dramatic reduction. And as part of this work, one thing I started doing 3 years ago when this work came out is working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Has anyone heard of the IPCC? Okay, so it's a lot of acronyms here. So just to give you the background, it started in 1990 as a way to provide a basis of information for the UN climate negotiations that were just starting then. And so every 7 years, there's a large report. It's volunteers that are chosen of about a few hundred scientists from around the world. I'm in the latest round, and it's only maybe 10% US. It's a truly international effort, which I think is fantastic because you get developing country perspectives that are front and center, and developed country people like me have to confront them when we're making statements about, we should use more solar. We have to think about how it works in Ghana and other places. So it's been a fantastic experience, a ton of work. We get review comments that we have to respond to each of them individually. We've got 20,000 review comments over the last 3 years, and we came out with this report. And yeah, it's been nice to be involved with that. My work was actually featured in 5 of the chapters because everyone wants to tell this solar story. And one thing that I experienced being part of the IPCC is there's a shared concern that the problem is urgent, we need to do something about it quickly. Everybody agrees on that. It's one of the main messages of the report. What's different is the theory of change. And I would say for the overwhelming majority of the scientists who worked on this, the theory of change is light a fire by telling people how bad it is and how little progress we're doing and how much we need to get going. And I just don't think that that works that well. My theory of change is much more, let's find the things that are working, find the cities that are doing things well, the technologies where things are moving, show people that progress is not linear, it tends to go in an S-curve, we have slow progress, and at some point things take off. We're starting to see that in some of these technologies. And so I worked hard to get that kind of more positive message out, but it's not, even among people that really are solid about the climate issue, it's not uniformly accepted. So one of the parts of this project that was especially kind of interesting to me is there's this 3,000-page report that gets published that people can use and refer to if they want. But then there's a 30-page summary, which is, let's pull it all together, what are the main takeaways? And I'll just say a couple things about that summary. One is that I got some of my key figures to feature in the summary, and one of the reasons that people didn't want these in the summary is because they're too positive. They're showing that maybe it's not that urgent, that things actually are happening, we don't need to get on top of things. But I just don't think, I think people need to see some encouragement and signs of things. I mean, this is dramatic, and it's not just solar. It's like solar's had this dramatic fall. This gray area here is the cost of electricity from coal and natural gas plants around the world. In a lot of places now, solar beats it without subsidies, and in other places it's pretty competitive. And with the subsidies with IRA, it's going to be really competitive in lots of places. That's why when you saw Drew's graphs, it just takes off. That's happening with solar. Onshore wind, not as steep, but well below fossil costs. And then this is the one that's really changing things because we're getting into a new sector, electric vehicles, where we can start to use low carbon clean electricity that's getting really cheap. and start to use it instead of gasoline and diesel, so we can use it for transportation, and that makes a tremendous difference. And when you start to look at how this has happened, it's the same playbook from solar. So scaling up manufacturing, perfecting this technology, iterating it, making lots and lots of them, and it's working, and we're starting to do the same thing on heat pumps, and it's really making things move. So it's not just the cost, but it's the adoption. This is exponential growth. You know, when something grows at 30% a year, it's doubling about every 2 years, and it's doubling and then goes to 4 and then goes to 8 and then goes to 16, and that's why you see this explosive growth here. So even though people say, all right, 3% of the world's electricity comes from solar now, that doesn't sound like very much. But if that's growing at 30% a year and continues to, then, you know, pretty soon solar photovoltaics is more than 100% of today's electricity supply. We're not that far away. Grow 30% for 10 years and see where you are. We'll be almost all solar by then. So we'll see what happens with that. These are also growing really quickly. So then maybe I'll just slow down for a second and then just talk about this approval process. So here's the report that comes out. But this was just kind of more of a personal story, kind of eye-opening to me. But in the end was an optimistic thing. So we have this 30-page summary, and it's really different from the other 3,000 pages. So the other 3,000 pages, lots of work, lots of review, lots of iteration, lots of effort. It worked out well. The 30 pages it's not the International Panel of Scientists on Climate Change, it's the Intergovernmental Panel. So that means that every UN government, 195 governments, go through, and we do this all together, go through every line of text of 9,000 words and approve one sentence at a time. And we did that for 2 weeks in March, this past March. And at the end of 2 weeks, on the Friday night, we had gotten a third of the text approved. And we had to go into overtime. We canceled our celebratory party that Saturday, and then just went all-nighter for the next 2 days. And it was one of the most frustrating things of my life, because the countries, not all the countries, the petrostates held all the cards. They had a veto power on all of this, and they used it. And we spent days of just things like, I remember this very senior delegate from Brazil in tears begging one of the representatives of one of the petrostates, please can you just have some flexibility so we can move on to the next sentence? And the response was the same one we've been getting for 4 days, which was, unfortunately, we've exercised all the possible flexibility we had, and we just cannot approve that sentence. And there was nothing constructive, and it was completely obstructive and hugely frustrating. But on the other hand, it was probably the coolest experience I've had in my academic career, because I got to be face to face with the other side, with the people that we blame for delaying and undermining things. They're often lurking in the background and working behind the scenes, but here they were. And you know, from time to time over those 2 days, I was the one on the podium defending why these costs are real and why it's not made up and why we should have it in the report. And you know, eventually the tide started turning. We got people to start accepting some of this text. We spent 3 hours from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. on the last night approving one sentence that said the world needs to substantially reduce its use of fossil fuels. And everybody here knows that's obvious. Of course we need to do that. But now Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, other petrostates are on the record of saying, yeah, we agree. We approve that sentence and it's in the report. And so yeah, we eventually approved this on the 2 days after we should have gotten approved. And, you know, it's substantial. And, you know, part of me is like, why do we have these governments here? Why can't we just tell them what the science says? But they provide legitimacy. And now, I remember one of the delegates saying, you know, we can take this report and bring it to our environmental ministry and say, look, we do have to reduce fossil fuels. But look, this is the cost of solar now. And it was worth doing for that effort. And so I came away actually enthused about this whole process, that, you know, it was a struggle and there was a lot of waste involved. But in the end, you know, kind of reason and science did end up overcoming the power of these other side that had all the cards, because they could always just walk away or not approve it. And we really thought this wouldn't be approved at one point. And so it's really kind of, I don't know, kind of fueled my optimism for continuing on in this area. And I think that's the last thing I'll just say. Like, I teach this stuff in classes all the time, and I think I realized at some point that I was making clear how slow the energy system is to change and how slow the climate system is to respond to any differences we do with it. And I felt like after a while I was just making those points too well, because the students were just like, yeah, we get it. It's impossible. So now I've come up with this, the list. In my classes I always talk about a list of 10 reasons I'm optimistic on climate change, and I've gotten more confident in them over time. Other people have other things on their list. But actually I've started flipping away from that and just thinking it's maybe simpler, that the reason to be optimistic on climate change is because we have a moral responsibility to be optimistic. If we are skeptical or just say it's too hard or it's impossible or those petrostates are just going to get their way, that's what will happen. And so when I see what happened with the IRA and all the work that POW did and others have done, I mean, that's exactly what we need to do. Skepticism is, and pessimism, it's like, it's easy and it's safe and it's really lazy. And I think we just need to find a way to look at some of these models that are working, find these solutions that are growing, they're becoming more affordable. They're getting used in places that aren't the richest places in the world, and they're making cities better and they're making people's lives better. And so I think those little kernels and nuggets and scaling them up is a big part of what we need to do. So I feel great to be around a bunch of people that kind of have this outlook and are making things happen. So yeah, thanks for the chance to be here today.
Great job, everybody. Love the optimistic viewpoint. You showed the adoption, like, just going way up on the graph. How does that compare to energy consumption? Do you have any data on that?
Well,
like, are we outpacing it, I guess, is the biggest question.
Yeah. One thing that we got this kind of question a lot, because this is a share, it does kind of take into account how, as energy is growing, how much renewables count for it. So yeah, it's more than keeping up with energy consumption. Energy consumption is growing, but like 1% a year globally, whereas these things are growing at 30% a year. So I also work on trying to find ways to lower that, because that's important, and there's huge scope for that as well. So yeah, it's another good part of the story as well.
Meg?
I have a question for you as well. I was noticing in the graph the downward trend of cost of battery storage.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear your perspective on battery innovation, especially since it's still pretty environmentally taxing. Like, do you see the IRA really helping with that? And have you heard of anything like, boots on the ground right now that's in development? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, with any growth of any technology, there's going to be problems, and it might be supply chain problems, might be resource problems, might be human rights problems with Democratic Republic of Congo. But there's innovation away from that. Tesla's starting to use less cobalt in their batteries, and maybe finds a way to do none. And I think with the IRA, the thing that's most interesting to me is $69 billion for domestic manufacturing, and that's going to be advanced manufacturing, because you can't try to compete with China by making lithium-ion batteries or silicon solar cells. You need to go next generation to compete. And so I think that part of the IRA is going to be helpful in addressing some of those issues, using different materials, for example.
Yeah, just for all three of you, really, what are some of the useful tools or kind of takeaways that you've had from the more difficult conversations, whether it's a land manager from a conservative state or a representative from a petro nation? Like, what are some of the ways that you can find, we use common ground a lot, but what are some of the ways we can kind of make those conversations more productive and get some of these, one sentences approved?
Just
I think it helps to just center on the land and what connects us, and that's what POW's really, really good at. Because if we focus on what we all love, I think that connects us as people, then having the next step in the conversation is easier. But it comes back to, I don't think anyone's going to argue against making the world a better place. It's just, the question is, what is their role in it? So if we help people identify their role in a positive way and how they can help improve their environment, improve their communities, protect their families, future generations, then we're all in a good place and we can move forward.
Thank you.
But one thing I get sometimes is like uncertainty. Like, yeah, but we don't know. Like, the climate's always been changing, or it's just the sun or volcanoes or something like that. And, I've been in situations where it's all a conservative thing, and if I just say, no, you're wrong, that's not going to work. And so I try to find a nugget, and I'll say, there are parts that we don't know. We don't know how bad it'll get. We don't know how fast it will go. We don't know the specific precipitation effect in Reno, Nevada. But we know it's going to be bad, and it's a question of when and how much. And so, trying to find something that you find a basis for agreement, and then going from there, I find sometimes helps.
Thanks.
I live in a little bit of a different world around this because of what I work on, but I honestly find that, at least from sort of the social justice aspects of it, people just really don't know. They don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about these things, and they're not actually that visible unless you're somebody who actively looks for them, and then they suddenly feel like they're very visible, right? But in my experience, people will ask questions, and you just have to sort of wait with those questions, right? Let them talk. One of my favorite things to do as I've been doing this work is just sit on chairlifts and tell people what I do, and just let them talk at me, and see what happens. And some of them don't want to engage, but on an 18-minute ride up the gondola at Aspen, some of them start asking questions if you give them long enough. So some of them have asked to go ski with me for a few runs, right? So take those opportunities.
For Jenny, is there a carbon easement to take land out of alfalfa, and what would that cost, and does that affect the cost of alfalfa, and what would that be replaced with, what kind of forage and stuff?
That's what we're heading towards. The first step is developing a system where we can quantify what's there and how it's changed over time. And then the second step is starting to work with the economists, going through the numbers, thinking about if you swap out something, replace it with something else, but it's still a viable resource for the community, and it protects the environment and uses less water, maybe there's value there. And that's something I mentioned. San Miguel County, the county commissioners, they're very interested in those questions, but until we have the data, that baseline, and that's what we're working towards, is starting with the baseline. And then hopefully we can solve these problems, and in 10 years I can tell you, or maybe even sooner. But water is the other thing too, and that was really surprising for me working in Colorado, is how poorly water is used in some of these irrigated lands. And there's kind of this, I found, use it or lose it mentality. So if you have water rights, you're just dumping water on your plants more than they need because you don't want to use it. And so this has really kind of opened the door for me. I started out thinking about carbon ecosystems, but now I'm having to get into water law and think about what really drives those actions. So I think if we can connect water with the decision-making process, that is going to make it that much more viable, so we can accomplish something sooner.
I'm wondering if, kind of building on that, because I think I talked to someone from Woodwell about this specific project, because I live in Montrose County.
Yeah.
And we're surrounded by rangelands, and there, two thoughts came up. Well, one was the kind of native plants question, which kind of you answered about what's happening with the plants. But the second, kind of the build on that, is when we look at what happens, or the potential for what could happen with rangelands, and either converting them from tilled agricultural land back to rangeland, or potentially being sold for development, which is certainly an issue in San Miguel County, as you know. Do you, once you plug in the economists into the conversation, is there, I guess my question is that something that can ever be quantified, to say, here's what happens if we take your till, it's horrifying to see the tilled lands, just dust blowing everywhere, and all of this potential economic loss, but also damage to the land. And then beyond that, if we keep it as rangeland, this is not benefiting the community more so than potentially developing it, because it just brings in all these questions of how it's even a good idea. That was really complicated, like 25 questions. Sorry.
Okay, get me through this. So the first thing that comes to mind is, I think when we're talking about natural landscapes, it's so important to identify the landscapes that are still intact. They're functioning like they should have. And protect them. Like protect them at all costs. Because once you degrade something, like we saw across the West, that map with all the red, and that's our reality. We have overused and we've degraded lands, and we have to acknowledge that we probably won't ever restore it, but to rehabilitate it so it's a functioning landscape that captures carbon, that uses energy well, and uses water efficiently, and has value with the native plants and biodiversity, that full holistic approach. To move towards that, when you start with something that's really degraded and you're in a water limited system, it's really expensive. So that's the first step. So first, protect. Second step is identify these areas that we want to try to rehabilitate. And then the question is, what do they become and who pays for it? So a lot of these ranchers that we've worked with that aren't owned, the ranchers, so there's kind of like this two different sets of ranching communities right now. There's the people who have a lot of money who are buying up land, who are more interested in rehabilitation because they can pay for it. And then there's these ranchers who have been there generations, and that's all they have. They are so connected with that land, and they want to do something about it. They just can't pay for it. So that's another question that we're facing, is how do we help people help their land? And then what do we want to look, what do we do in the future? What do we want it to look like? And that's something we have to answer as a community.
Good questions.
Did I answer everything?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a lot of questions that I don't even know how to pull apart in my head, so thank you. It's a good structure.
I just want to add 2 cents to this discussion that I've learned about a major center-right foundation push for climate solutions in the Farm Bill next year, all in this domain. And so getting organized about great policy ideas for the climate solutions in that Farm Bill might be something POW and you might want to be involved in.
We should talk, because I'm heading to DC next week to talk about Farm Bill. And what I've noticed in Farm Bill is, yes, a lot of big ag benefits. It doesn't necessarily help these smaller farming communities.
Yeah, that's the norm.
And so thinking about, what that message should be next week. It's a good point.
I come from the big solar plant world. We build large-scale solar plants, taking thousands of acres down. So I just did some quick math. But the industry itself is taking down in the order of a couple 100,000 acres across the U.S., both farmland and wildland. Do you guys, have thoughts on sort of things that we can do better? We do a lot of mitigation work and do work in terms of land set-asides, but how do we make sure, that there's always sort of the cost benefit. I hate to use that, but there's a cost benefit of what we do, and we do have impact. Are there thoughts on things that we should pay more attention to as we think about the future, which is going to be, like I said, taking out of the system in the order of a couple 100,000 acres a year?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd say, it's a lot, but in the big picture, if you look at the whole planet, the amount of solar we need to power the whole planet, if we only did solar, it's like 1% of land, which is a lot, but and you could spread that all over the place. So, I mean, the land use parts of solar are not, I don't think it's a deal breaker. And things we need to do, you could do it well and you could do it badly. And in communities where there's people around, aesthetics matter. So, doing it behind hedgerows, or finding ways to make it not look industrial, finding ways to not completely, gravel the surface, but use like native plants in between. There's a lot of work now in agrivoltaics where you mix shade-tolerant plants with solar panels and doing things offshore with solar too. So I think clearly there's ways to do it badly and ways to do it well, but if we're going to do a lot and go fast, we're going to have to do it well, otherwise we get public backlash to people that
I just gotta, if I can word this right,
Danny, when you just said you've worked with ranchers, they've been doing this for multiple generations, and there's some emotion in that because you've met them and you have these feelings for that. And then is it Jesse? Right?
Yep.
There's generations before that. So where's the intersection between what we feel for the rancher and for hundreds or thousands of years beforehand, there were generations that already had the land, and we have more empathy for somebody who's like 5th generation rancher. You're like, well, we're like 200 generation, and you took it from us. Where is that intersection?
I could tell you about a failed attempt.
So there is like, so Snowball itself is interesting because the ranchers actually don't really care that much about the resort, and they're not the ones skiing on it, and a lot of them have known the indigenous families there for a very long time as well. And they're really not the issue, right? It's people bringing money into Flagstaff. There are certainly, you certainly see these conflicts, especially between ranchers and indigenous communities, a lot of places, and a lot of those conflicts are driven by large-scale agriculture, by large-scale ranching, by politics of resentment for people feeling left behind, right? Like, there's obviously a long history of violence between these communities, but there's also a really long history of these communities intermarrying and coexisting and sharing these spaces. And so it's often like the most problematic aspects or the biggest driving causes tend to be the outside influences, right? If you look at somewhere like the Dakotas where you have all these pipelines, the issue is that these communities are fighting over who is going to be affected by the fallout of a pipeline, right? It is not that, white communities there are just like, no, we want to pollute these indigenous reservations, right? So that's sort of where I think you have to start looking to thinking on that broader level, right? The local is global and the global is local sort of mentality.
So last fall, I co-led a conversation that lasted 2 days that was focused on rangelands held at Montana State University and sponsored by Ted Turner. And the idea was to get everyone in the same room, the scientists, the land managers, indigenous perspectives, and a lot of the ranchers that we contacted who work and are part of indigenous communities did not want to be there because of that history. And so moving forward, because we do want everyone at the table, because all voices matter, we realize that there's a lot of work to be done just to build trust again, or at least pre-trust, just get everyone together. But it's necessary because we want everyone to benefit and everyone to be part of the conversation. So if people have ideas around that, I'd love to hear them because we tried and we didn't do very well.
It's worth looking, I worked with Long Valley, just below Mammoth, and there's a coalition, Keep Long Valley Green, and it's indigenous, ranchers, scientists, working together to fight LADWP from draining the valley. Right? And the ranchers need the water and spread it.
There's a sense of urgency.
And then there's the indigenous groups are part of that, and it's this really unique thing that's working.
That's great.
So obviously the Slack channel should be really busy later this week. So we're out of time for questions, but there's like a whole discussion about the future of agroautonomy here. But thank you all for giving us a mini science symposium. Like, really good.